We're back with State of Mind, and we're digging into something that was so apparent in Michael Cohen's testimony. The Donald Trump Code, a system for communicating even potentially criminal instructions, allegedly, through meaningful looks, winks, and nods, but never putting those orders in writing overtly.
Mr. Trump did not directly tell me to lie to Congress. That's not how he operates. In conversations we had during the campaign, at the same time, I was actively negotiating in Russia for him. He would look me in the eye and tell me there's no Russian business, and then go on to lie to the American people by saying the same thing. In his way, he was telling me to lie.
Tony Schwartz, friend of the Beat and co-author of The Art of the Deal, is here, and he says that while writing that book decades ago, Donald Trump would also communicate to him in code, saying, quote, "You understand," rather than explicitly saying what he was getting at. Schwartz argues that Trump was always aware, even then, of what might get him in trouble and wary that even those closest to him could turn on him.
What was the breaking point at which you decided to start telling the truth?
Helsinki, Charlottesville, watching the daily destruction of our civility to one another. And I can only warn people, the more people that follow Mr. Trump, as I did blindly, are going to suffer the same consequences that I'm suffering.
Tony Schwartz, CEO of the Energy Project, is the author of The Way We're Working Isn't Working.
You got it.
Nice to have you back.
Thank you.
Build on what you were telling us here.
I just had Michael Cohen evoke for me that experience of, I'm going to just state it a slightly different way. You understand, Tony, right? You understand. It was literally a wink, because he lived this public life even when he wasn't really a public figure, which is, how's this going to come back at me? Where's this going to play? And so he was always playing the angles. This is what a grifter does. This is what a mafia boss does. And his style was to be aware of what the impact might be and not to put himself too far, put his toe right up to the edge, but not put it in.
Doesn't that raise the deeper question of why he never wanted to pivot and get out of that mode of being? If he had certain momentary successes, get out of being, as you call it, a grifter?
I think that he lived inside such a small world. You know, he had this very narrow view of the world, and he saw it, and has always seen it, as a world in which it's all predators, and he has to be constantly aware of, he believes that a person is either a predator or is a loser, and he is always determined to be on the side of the predator. So the idea that he would somehow rise above it, I don't think was within his worldview.
And what's interesting, because as someone who literally wrote this book that launched him, you've talked about how he wasn't such a reader or a writer himself. But that insight, that way of looking at the world, is what many writers have said, and Machiavelli and Hobbes and others. It's certainly the way he's running the White House. As we're talking, I have another breaking story. As you know, it's always that kind of thing that's perfect for what you're talking about. New York Times reports tonight, Trump ordered officials to give his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a security clearance. That's significant because it says intelligence officials actually were concerned that would endanger U.S. security. And in an interview on the record with the Times itself, President Trump had said, quote, he was never involved with the security clearance of Kushner. Your view of how that fits in at the expense, potentially, according to the officials, of our security?
Very consistent with what Cohen said, which is he's telling him to pursue the Russian hotel deal and saying we have no business in Russia at the same time. So I'm quite sure he wanted Jared right by his side. Why? Because he believes that Jared is somebody who will not be disloyal. And so he would say, you know, we're going to do this. And he would also wink and nod at, and by the way, I never said this.
So he would know, even as he's doing it, how to try not to get busted?
Well, at least to create an aura around him that the last thing on earth you should do if you are working for him is to contradict what he's saying, even if he calls this a tennis ball.
The last thing I want to ask you about is sensitive. Chairman Cummings, I think, moved a lot of Americans in the way he conducted and closed the hearing. And he alleged, in quite serious terms, that the way Donald Trump publicly identified Cohen as a rat puts him in physical danger in prison. Do you think Trump appreciated that risk, liked it, his view of the specter of violence?
Well, I think I've said to you before that Trump loves violence. I mean, he was an aficionado of boxers. He loved football. He likes violence. Very first time I wrote about him, the picture on the cover of New York Magazine was of him as a thug. He put that picture up on the wall of his office. So
wow.
I think he gets off on violence. So my answer would be yes.
Right. And that's something that Chairman Cummings, who we've reported is quite careful about these things, was putting on the record in a serious way.
He doesn't hear it. Yeah. Trump doesn't hear it.
Tony Schwartz, always appreciate your insights here on our State of Mind series. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.